That's a lie. I briefly said launch party instead of starting soon. Very tiny baby technical issues. You're not Ramon. So well, just to introduce, because this is our very special secret guest, Mr. Mills.
Hiya.
And for Mr. Mills's benefit, or for anybody who's just joining us who hasn't been following along this whole time, we're doing something a little bit weird. So, good morning. It's morning for some of y'all getting up early in the morning to do this. I respect it, but it couldn't be me. So, what we're doing is we're running a free, remote, part time, online, hopefully low stress programming boot camp based around the Free Code Camp web development track. And what we're going to do today is we're going to look at one of the projects. And I've brought my very favorite special guest to come and help us with it because you've got some special expertise that's likely to help us, right?
Well, if you want to write good documentation for projects, that's totally my jam.
Is it?
I was the content lead for MDN Web Docs at Mozilla
Oh.
for a number of years, and I've been writing technical documentation for about a squillion years before that. So
This is actually fantastic timing. By accident, by chance, we're going to be doing the technical documentation project. And
such a synergy leveraging thing.
really, so strange. So strange that I asked you to come and join us today of all days. But what we're going to do is I'm a really mean teacher and I try not to do too much work for our learners. So what we're going to do is we're going to break this down. And I was wondering if you'd pair program with me. So I'll do the typing and you just sort of talk me through, if you saw these user stories, what kind of code might you expect to write? And with this, I'm not going to write a ton of code because I'm going to leave it for the learners to do in their own way. But just back and forth, just chat about this. So we've got our objective and we've got this. That doesn't work. We can't see it yet. But we're looking for some documentation that has functionality that feels a little bit like this. Kind of convenient because it's about JavaScript and we're going to be starting the JavaScript bootcamp on February 12th. So we're going to when we say the functionality will be the same, it doesn't have to look like this, does it?
No, so just to recap and make sure I'm understanding this, each of the folks that are taking part in this are going to write a documentation page relating all to JavaScript, or is it all related to their own project or whatever
That's
they want to do?
fantastic. So they can do it about JavaScript. They don't have to. This could be technical documentation about anything.
Cool.
Last year, we had somebody who did some technical documentation about making the best chili, which I kind of liked because, oftentimes technical documentation feels a little bit like a recipe.
Absolutely. So that's useful to know. So I suppose, obviously, I don't want to give too much away in the first instance, but I would say, the first thing you need to ask yourselves is, what is it that this documentation is trying to teach? What's the subject and what are the end goals?
Ooh, hang on. I'm going to come back to this.
Okay.
So really, we're not even looking at the user stories yet. We're thinking to ourselves, and I'm going to write this as an HTML comment. Step 1 is pick the topic. Okay. And what's the second thing you said? Decide on the
end goals. What are the learning objectives for the content that you're going to write?
Okay, I'm going to move these comments down just so they feel a little bit more spaced out in my head. So this seems unfair. So even before we start doing these user stories and getting our test to pass, we have to start to think about the content that we're going to be writing.
I suppose you could also talk about what's the style of the content.
Ooh.
And what's the target audience?
Oh, the
Is the
target
target
audience.
audience people that have never ever come across this thing that you're writing out before? Or are they already experts in some parts of it and just need a refresher?
So I'm going to actually throw this out to the learners. So anybody who's here, if you have an idea for what we should use for our sample technical documentation, let me know. And so yeah, if you have an idea, say, oh, I want documentation. I've got an idea, but it's a little cruel and it's especially unkind to you. But if other folks have an idea, say, oh, I want to do documentation about how to fix your bike tires. I want documentation on how to start a learning plan to track your learning. We'll do documentation about whatever people want. And Nikita makes a really solid point. So when we've been going through the boot camp, we either do lessons, which are just like, do this, then do that. But for the projects, learners have to choose what they want to show off. And really thinking of the content of these websites is often harder than the programming.
Absolutely. I mean, if you're writing documentation specifically about technology, an app that you've written or an API that you've created, this
What's an
underscores
API?
the value of great code comments because really
Ooh.
that could be considered the start of your documentation in many ways, or at
Shall
least
we
the
do?
basis.
Yeah. I'm going to pick the topic because I haven't seen I'm faster than other people. How to oh oh gosh, so Eric made documentation project around GitHub. Amazing. Oh, that's not bad because you could just go to the GitHub documentation and move some of it over. Oh, I didn't even think of that. So if you just want to practice making the website and you're not that fussed about the technical writing, you could use content from someplace else as long as you cited it, as long as you didn't steal.
Um, A good point, though, about something like GitHub is that it can be such a hugely complicated topic that there's great value in pulling content down and just trying to simplify it for a very beginner audience or a very specific subset of the audience that have very specific goals.
Hmm. Oh, so like how to put your free code camp projects on GitHub.
Yeah, exactly. How to publish your project on GH Pages would be a very, very simple, specific goal to explain people to how to do,
Yeah.
which would get them a little more comfortable with the monster that is GitHub.
How to publish your free code camp projects to GitHub. And GitHub Pages isn't the only way to do this, is it? We could use a tool called Netlify. We could upload it to some hosting as files. But this seems like a good way to go. So I feel like this is cheating because my topic is how to publish my free code camp projects to GitHub Pages. I feel like that's the goal of the documentation too? Or
Yeah, but you'd you'd probably break that goal down into you'd probably break the overall topic down to some sub goals, such
okay,
as how to get it onto a repository in the first place, for example.
how to sign up for GitHub? How Oh, this is nice and stressful. So let's actually look at let me get it up in another page just to make sure I'm not gonna show you my work when I get up at GitHub. Oh, do you know what? I forgot that all of my work is open source. It can't hurt us. So it's not gonna be super fun for me to do my work live on this. So GitHub, let's just talk about this a little bit, then we'll go through some of the user stories. And we had one of our learners, not yesterday, but on Wednesday saying, "Oh, this one MDN page doesn't make any sense to me." So I thought I thought it might be especially good to get you here for this.
They only found one. I'm impressed.
It's clearly not one of the ones you wrote.
No, of course not.
So GitHub is hmm, let's back this up a little bit. So when we're writing our code here in the free code camp editor, This is someplace for us to write code, so it's a code editor, but the preview is also displaying our code, really only to us, not really for users. And I think GitHub does something pretty similar, where once you sign up and sign in, well, you can create what's a repository? It's a very, very long. So a repository is kind of like a folder for a specific project. And
It's
here we can add a description. Oh, please.
it's a bucket.
It's a bucket. It's a bucket we can put our stuff in. And we're going to document a little bit. So here I can say my bucket, anybody can see what's in my bucket, or my bucket is private. I'm going to politely ignore licenses existing right now because I don't want to teach my learners about licenses so far.
It also doesn't matter until you actually start sharing it with other people to collaborate on your code,
Ah,
which isn't really a problem right at this juncture.
Nikita makes a really good point. Nikita's like, oh, do you know what? Git and GitHub are two separate things. And that's a really reasonable mistake to make, right? And Derek is saying GitHub is based off Git. Okay. Git is a type of version control system. And I really like to think of this as it's like selective time travel. Git is a process that lets you save your code at different processes, like you might save a long video game. And then it gives you the option to go back. If something bad happens, you can go back to one of your past saves.
But it also gives you the opportunity to create alternate realities of your video game save, in which one thing happens in one version, then one thing happens in another version. And then you can choose which reality you like the best.
Oh,
And
that
then,
metaphor fell apart really fast. I was like, "Hey, it's like saving your game," and then you're like, "But there's other players." It's like a Paper Mario level, which would have been a very, very good reference some time ago.
I loved Paper Mario.
So, we're just looking at but what we're really gonna do today is we're gonna come all the way back to the project. We're gonna do none of the project for the learners today. I thought we'd just talk through a little bit of this. I'd give them some homework. We always do a really short session on projects because these are the hardest part, and I like to be as mean as possible to the learners. But I thought we'd go through this, we'd break down a little bit of what kind of code we'd be writing. Um, and then maybe while we do it, have a little bit of a conversation about documentation in general and like how do you know what I'd love to let know? How do I use documentation when I'm new? So, like, how do I start to interact with documentation where it's referring to words I don't know to explain the word I don't know? Come back to that in a bit.
Yeah.
So, you work with a bunch of developers. Is this kind of how you might expect to see user stories where they're written as prose, they're written as a sentence, not telling us step by step what to do?
Um, I think if it's kind of a new documentation type or documentation project, you might expect to see these. But given that I've done work on MDN for over 10 years now, I'm very old. It's more kind of what you're going to expect. You're going to be writing one of these three different kinds of documentation. So and they're all very formulaic in how you do them. So really, it's more just the case of the engineer says we have this new JavaScript API that needs documenting in the same way that you did all of the other Squillian JavaScript APIs that you did in the past. Sometimes there'll be differences. There's been quite a few differences really with some of the weird new API stuff that Google's been doing just lately. That have required some kind of extra exceptions and things, but mostly it's just the same. So yeah, at the point I am, you don't really have user stories anymore because they're all just the same.
Okay, this is really interesting. So we're thinking about a brand new project where you're talking to a client who's building something for the first time versus, hey, you've made how many MDN documentation pages are there? Maybe like 10 or 20?
There's over 15,000, and that's just the English ones.
Ooh. I've got some questions I will take offline because almost immediately I want to ask, oh, what are you using for localization? Um, and that's not a question that's going to be immediately relevant to beginners with web. Localization is when you take content that's in one language, often in English, doesn't have to start in English, and you start to not just translate it, but translate it and make it appropriate and fitting for folks in other languages and in other markets. I love localization. It's so messy.
It is very messy.
So, for these user stories, one thing we've noticed in these projects is when we first started with Free Code Camp, it would tell us declare your doc type. It looks like this. Start an HTML tag. It looks like this. They just sort of gave up on that. They trust us now, and they kind of trust us a bit more than they should trust me. So I'm going to leave this question up for the learners because I'm very lazy. It's telling me to start that I need a main element. What do I need on my page before I start to put the main element down? What boilerplate code do I need to get this started? And while I make them do all my homework, let's bounce back and forth and take a look at MDN. Oh gosh, and do you know what? I might get you to continue to back up. Like your work on MDN, that's incredibly professional. That's incredibly impressive, right?
Maybe.
He's too British to say yes. Um, so very, very professional, very, very deadly serious. Do you always know what you're doing?
I think that's one of the key things about being a technical writer is one of your kind of main superpowers is that more often than not, you don't know exactly what you're doing because you're constantly having new things thrown at you that you've got no idea what they are, and you have to kind of develop a working knowledge of them in a very, very short space of time. So really, I'd say my superpower is that I'm not the greatest coder or developer in any one language, but I'm very good at picking up things super quickly.
So can you talk to us a little bit? What is a technical writer?
A technical writer is somebody that writes documents that explain how to use technology,
Ooh.
I would say. I suppose, there are some variations of that. So there are various different different types of documentation. So the explainers that I'm talking about, you'd probably call those tutorials or guides. That's what people mostly think about when they think of documentation. But then also a very important part is the reference documentation. So the reference documentation doesn't teach you how to use the technology, but it just includes all of the details really exhaustively in a way that you can look up things very quickly, if you can't remember what that syntax is. And then the third category I would say there really is, you could argue till the ends of the earth about all of these different subcategories, but I'd say the main third category is conceptual documentation. And that's really kind of, we're not teaching you exactly at a low level how to write the code to make this thing happen, but we're teaching you at a higher level why this thing exists, why it's a good idea, why you might want to use it. I'd also classify things like explaining words that you don't know what they mean as conceptual documentation. If somebody's, if you want to know what, say, a method is, you don't want someone to say, there are 3,000 methods and you can do this, this, and this, and this, and this. You just want 3 sentences explaining you at a high level what a method is and maybe how it differs from a function, but that's it, just at that
Oh,
kind of level.
so the types of documentation that people might want to write for this project are tutorials. Here's how to do this. Reference. Here's what this means. And remind me what that last one you said is?
Conceptual documentation.
Conceptual. Ah, cool. I'm just typing them out as the comments as we go. Amazing. So everything is low key. I think that I might not do any, not much. So let's just talk through. Let's continue to bully our learners into talking to us about what we need to do here. So here we've got our main element. Oh gosh, Cleo makes some other good points. Say, hey, do you know what? A technical writer might also write templates. So the outlines for documents that get used again and again, and also things like white papers. So stuff that feels a little bit technical and maybe sometimes a little bit marketing. We've got game design documents. Okay, so a technical writer, would this be a good job for somebody who's learning to program and wants to learn more?
I would say definitely, because you learn so much as you document new technologies. And even when it's technologies that you already know really well, you can still learn new things in the process of explaining those technologies to others.
As a stretch goal for this project, folks, you can do it on whatever you want as long as it meets the code of conduct if you share it. But I might say it might be a really good stretch goal to do this documentation on something you want to learn more about. So in order to do this very first user story, Mr. Grubward points out, you need a doc type, and it didn't tell us to do a doc type. You're gonna probably you said HTML, so start your HTML and set your language. Here we say English. It doesn't have to be English. Bwahaha. And then you're gonna want your head and body elements. The main's gonna want to sit inside your body. You're gonna want some stuff in your head as well, but this is a really good outline. So immediately from there with this project, we start breaking down feel things that feel a lot like the past projects. So create some section elements, at least 5. It's gonna be headers inside that. I know I've brought you on to talk about documentation. I was talking through this really fast so I don't cheat the learners too much. Each section needs to have its own ID. Okay. Okay, I've got that. Oh, and it's gonna match. Okay, that makes sense. The main section should have at least 10 paragraph elements. This is not what a spec looks like. So when your boss comes to you and says, "Oh, you're a contractor," when your clients come, "Oh, is that useful to talk about really fast?" So within tech, you can be an employee, or within most jobs, you can be an employee or a contractor. What's sort of the difference here? What's does it matter?
So I would argue that it having been both a contractor and an employee, there's a bunch of differences based on whether you want to work for yourself and have complete control over your own destiny. Well, not complete control, but more control over your own working life and hours and how you do things. That would be the contractor route. Or whether you want to be more part of a big machine or a small machine that does a specific thing, and that's more the working for a company route. And there's advantages and disadvantages of both. As Raymond points out, if you work for a company, you're liable to get them giving you benefits such as guaranteed regular salary, as well as things like medical care, perhaps, or gym passes, and it's a bit more secure. Whereas when you work for yourself, you have to find all of the work yourself.
So we're veering into general advice, but if I'm brand new and learning programming skills for the first time, it's going to be pretty hard to be a contractor first thing, huh?
I would I would say it is a bit more difficult because being a successful contractor does rely on you having a network of contacts to find work through. Although there are ways around it. I mean, one anecdote that I would love to share that I really like is a friend of mine many years ago. Um, he was only 17 when he did this, and he became a freelance PHP developer. And the way he did
Wait,
that,
wait, wait. What's PHP?
PHP is a server-side programming language. So it's
We'll
something that
learn
sits
about
on
what server side means in the JavaScript one, I promise. So it's just a
okay.
different programming language like JavaScript.
But anyway, so my friend became a developer by going through the local phone book and phoning up every single number of every single business he found in the local area and asking every single one if they'd like a website.
So
And that's what started him off. And, you know, it takes a lot of bravery to do that. So I was
yeah,
very proud of him.
fabulous. So we're going to go through just a couple more of these steps just to make sure we're not completely abandoning you because we said we'd go over the project. Um, and to be honest, we're going to get more and more conceptual about these projects and abandon you more, what you, the learner, not you, Chris. But I feel like we can abandon you to do your work on your own. And it's because these user stories really just tell us about what we need to have in our HTML, maybe our CSS as well. Okay, so we are saying we're going to use a header element in the navbar class. Hello world. So this is the only thing I see that relates to CSS is telling us our technical documentation has to have at least one media query. And we learned about those yesterday. Oh, we might look at the documentation for media query because folks thought that was a little stressful. And by folks, I mean me. Um, so for these projects, the more we go through, we've got 2 more left until people get their certifications and they're done. The tests will get you just enough to pass. You only have to write a little tiny bit of CSS to pass and get your certification. But these projects, I love to encourage learners to do just enough where it passes and get that check mark, and then come back and make it their own later. So do some cool, weird things with CSS. The example we saw here was a little bit. It's a little. This documentation. It's a little bit boring, right? I mean, black and white. It's got good contrast. But nobody like there's no pictures? Hmm. I'd like for learners, if they're excited to do something a little bit flashier, a little bit more fun, or a little bit more creative. Speaking of, we're gonna do MDN. Because this said we need a media query. And half of why I asked you to join me today is I'm looking for somebody who's just going to agree with me that I'm absolutely right and that I'm brilliant. Because Ramon is often like, I don't think that's right. And it's very rude, really. When the learners don't know something or don't understand something, I say that we've got 3 different things we can do. You can ask somebody who knows, you can look it up, or you can get weird, you can experiment. Does that match? Can you think of anything else that folks could do? No, Jess, you're absolutely right. There are no other options.
I think we can just assume that most of us weren't listening. Carry on.
So, this is some documentation we had a challenging time with yesterday because this is really technical.
This is the issue with some of MDN's content. There is a whole ton of great content, but it's largely written for a kind of an existing technical audience and not complete beginners. Um,
Oh,
and for that reason, um, I created the learning area, which if you go to the guides menu at the top
guides.
and go to MDN learning area, this is my section of MDN, or kind of my baby, which is, unfortunately, it's again managed to get really, really dense because loads of people thought, hey, that's a great section, and just added tons of content to it. So it's now got a little bit dense again. So we could do with a little bit of work in trimming it down a bit. But
Oh,
the content specifically in this section will be friendlier to beginners/learners than possibly the rest of MDN. And in fact, the reason why this section exists is because I read a bunch of forum posts on Free Code Camp forums circa about 2015 saying, hey, MDN sucks, we can't understand it.
I'm just dropping this link in here. Amazing. And Mitch is saying, like, wow, you created that. Oh, yeah. I like
Yeah.
that level of credit. Yeah, like, yeah,
I I wrote probably 80, about 70% of the articles in this section and published them all. So
So if anybody has any problems with this, they should call you directly on your home phone.
it's all my fault.
So I think that you touched on something that's really exciting that I want to dig into a little bit more, because not the problem, but one of the reasons that the rest of MDN can be really hard for learners and folks new to a space is this idea called expert bias. So you say, "Oh, I'm going to use this expert language. I'm going to use this shared idea because I know it as an expert, and surely everybody else knows this." So if I'm a beginner and I'm seeing technical language on documentation I don't understand, I should chill out. I should feel bad. How should I feel about that?
You should always assume that it's the documentation's fault and not yours.
Oh, oh, I
I
like
think,
that.
if you can't understand it, because if something professes to suit your level and you just can't make head nor tail of it, it's generally the documentation that's too complicated rather than you that's too stupid. You should never think it's your fault, because
Oh,
that's rarely the
wow.
case, I would say. And it's always worth talking to the people that made the documentation to say, hey, could we improve the situation a bit? There will sometimes be reasons why stuff is in really complex language. For example, on reference documentation, particularly the MDN reference documentation, we take great efforts to be very, very comprehensive, meaning that we cover absolutely everything, regardless of how
Oh,
niche it is or how much of an edge case it is. And we always use very precise language to make sure that it's technically correct. Whereas I'd say in tutorials, there is a little bit more leeway to be a bit more playful with language. Because if everything's just written like a reference document, then life would be boring and nobody would learn.
so
Um,
you might not be surprised, but I really like this project, and I'm so excited to have the aim of this area of MDN. So this is like a smaller, friendlier, chiller. This is like the bad website club MDN zone. We'll just get you some like cute pink backgrounds for it. You'll be set. And really saying this area is about taking you from beginner to comfortable. That we're just going to do a nice chill tour. And here, if we want to learn about media queries, they're probably going to live in responsive design because we learned media queries are one way to set different CSS rules depending on sizes.
Look at the one just below it,
One just below it.
Beginner's Guide to Media Queries.
Okay, you just said if I miss something, I should blame the docs before I blame myself. This is the exception to the rule. This is my fault.
Yep. Well, this is not the docs, this is the navigation menu, so the rules don't apply here at all.
This seems a lot less scary. Let me tab between these in terrifying ways. Because we've got a couple different things going on. I'm gonna just duck go some things up in the background. So, wow, we've got a I know that this is probably not gonna be news to you, but are there a bunch of different MDN resources on Media queries?
Yes, there's the glossary article that you first showed, and really, given that that's supposed to be a glossary article, it should be shorter. Um,
So I'm going to do these from hardest to easiest for me.
mhm.
Oh, nope. So, media query. This is a glossary. So, this is documentation that's going to sort of describe the concept to me.
Yep,
So, this is a
but
definition.
it should give you a definition in a very, very high level way. To be honest, I would rewrite that page if I had the choice just to make it much shorter and more superficial, because the job of this page is not to teach you how to use media queries, but more to just give you an idea of what they are and why you should use them, what their purpose is.
So, I hear the phrase high level a lot in technology. What does high level mean?
So high level versus low level, there's probably again multiple different definitions of this, but high level, I would say, when you're describing technology, the high level is the concepts. This is, this technology exists because it allows you to write servers that do blah blah, or it allows you to grab video from a camera. It gives you just the concept of what it's for. This is so that people can build these kind of use cases. It is useful for this. Whereas low level is more, this is exactly the code that you use to build an application that captures video from a camera.
So,
That's the low level.
in a non-technical sort of way, a high level would be like looking at a town from an airplane and say, "Oh, cool. I can see that it has farms and office buildings and that there's a lake." Whereas low level would be coming all the way down to the ground and cataloging every single thing in the town
Going in
or
every
many
shop.
things in the town. Fab. And if anybody has any questions as we go ahead and drop them in. Otherwise, we'll talk a little tiny bit more about docs. We'll take a look at the project. Ooh, Nikita's got this. Oh, so PhD would be like really low level, like really detailed. Whereas just a sort of certificate of skills, like good job. Yeah. Oh, this is I like that much better than my describing every dog that lives in a town.
Yeah, that's good.
So this should be high level, but it's still got a lot going on. I think it's because these can be complicated, so it has to be complicated to describe them. And then we've got the actual documentation for the CSS syntax, for the grammar.
hmm So this is the reference doc for
Oh,
the at media at rule.
and I really like this because this lets us get weird. There's almost always in the reference docs a demo to change things.
This was another thing that we ended up adding to MDN purely just to make it a bit more accessible for beginners. Because when a beginner comes to a reference page and sees a load of really, really complicated technical terms and weird syntax, it's just scary. Whereas if the first thing you see is, here's an example that shows how to use this thing in a simple little sandbox, and here's some code that you can copy and paste and also edit,
Mm.
that is immediately much more accessible. And plus, when a lot of people visit documentation, their aim is not to learn anything really, but just to copy and paste some code they can dump into their own project just to make a thing happen.
Yeah, that sounds very, very doable and very chill. I'm just checking. So that's, and then we've got a guide about how to use media queries. And do you know
Mhm.
what? I'm going to drop these all in. So here's the glossary, just to understand these different types of documentation. This is the reference. Y'all are just getting, and is this a guide? Reference again. So this is reference
Um,
on how we use it.
so this is a guide, really.
This is a
It's a
guide.
it's a shame, but it says references in the breadcrumb trail at the top there because that's not really very helpful to what we're just talking about. But Generally, what we do on MDN is for each individual feature that we provide a reference to, we attach like a basic usage guide to that reference, just so that there's one easily available for every feature.
Okay. Whew. There's a lot going on all at once. What should I do if I'm working on a project or I'm reading documentation and stuff's really overwhelming? So this is a lot. I'm taking notes maybe? I'm what do I do when I'm looking at this documentation and it's too much?
Um, my brain is trying to think of an answer that isn't go to W3 schools. Um, I didn't say that. You can cut that out on the edit, can't you? Uh, I
Yeah,
know
but I
it's a
won't.
live stream. Um,
No, but that so not necessarily.
so I would say basically try and find some documentation that suits you at whatever level you feel most comfortable with right now. So
So switch documentation. Okay.
mhm,
So
try a
if
different
you're
flavor.
using like a product documentation, so if I'm looking at documentation for how to use a specific water bottle, I might not have a lot of choices. But if it's stuff like how to use media queries, I might try W3 schools. I might try Stack Overflow.
Hmm.
Okay, that's I have very different advice for people, but you're the expert. I usually tell people to log off for a little while and come back later.
That is the best advice.
Um,
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 Often, the best documentation resource you have is yourself, I tend to find. So, I don't know if you've told these folks about the concept of rubber ducking, but I love rubber ducking.
I have not talked about rubber ducking.
Yeah.
So I've got a very specific rubber duck, but what do you so rubber duck is a verb. What is rubber ducking?
So, the idea being that if you can't figure out the answer to a problem in your code or in some other kind of work, uh, go and talk to an inanimate object about it and explain what your problem is. And quite often you can figure out the answer by explaining the problem. Um, my my rubber duck tends to be my wife. I just walk into the other room and start ranting at her about how this horrid JavaScript won't do the thing I want it to do. And my wife is an artist and crochet queen. She's amazing, but she does not do tech at all. And usually after boring her into near unconsciousness for 10 minutes with talk about JavaScript, I go, oh, that must be what it is. And
So
something
the
will just fire
process.
somewhere. And traditionally, the inanimate object to speak to was supposed to be a rubber duck. That's what
So
someone did sometime, somewhere.
I'm glad you've said, "Oh, it's traditionally an inanimate object," but I talked to my wife, because I talked to my horrible cats. They're probably very good programmers, but they never give me a hint. And what I'll do is say, "Hey, I'm stuck on this. Here's what's happening in line 30." And I'll get about 3/4 of the way down and say, "Oh, I have a semicolon missing. That's fine."
I'd like to just clarify that, my wife has generally talked to her about programming for 5 minutes.
So, we've looked really brief. Oh, let's look at the last one. So, we started with the all the way through the guides, and then we've got this beginner's guide to media queries. So, we've switched documentation within MDN. So, whew, and this feels a lot less scary. So, if this is too much and we say, "Oh, this is a type of layout," we could jump back. We could go way, way back and say, "Hey, what's layout?" Okay. But this is giving us really, really laid back, really accessible language. Can we change the language? Oh, is it Japanese, Korean, and Chinese only?
I Well, in this case, yes, there are various pages which are translated into various different languages, but it's all done by community translation groups.
Oh,
So
wow.
the MDN core team has no control whatsoever over the translation, which we like it that way.
Oh, I think this one looks pretty good. So, actually, what you're saying is if somebody wanted some professional experience doing technical writing, they could help rewrite these in their home language.
Yep. Or,
Only if they wanted to.
yep, absolutely.
Where
If you
can they
want
do
to, no pressure at all. Please come into the MDN community and help to improve a page in some way or another.
How do we
And
do that? Is there a button at the bottom that says complain? Oh,
there is a button just if you go up slightly.
are you sure it's not MDN community?
There you go.
Ah
Edit the
ha
page on
ha.
GitHub. So this does assume that you have a GitHub account,
Okay.
but there is a link there which will,
Oh,
yeah.
and
So
this
then you
gets
fork it.
complicated. So
Yep,
a fork
exactly.
is me making a copy sort of where this page is now, and then I'd change the copy, and then I'd send that copy back to ask if you want it.
Hmm.
Okay, that
That
sounds
makes
really chill.
sense. This is the problem, you see, like all of MDN's content is contained in an enormous GitHub repository, which is like we mentioned
Big
earlier,
bucket.
a huge, huge bucket, and anybody that makes a change can, but you've got to have a few GitHub skills first. But
Okay.
so there you go.
Sorry,
Um,
we've got my rubber ducks coming to clamor all over the table. So if y'all see just the worst cats in the world, I'm very sorry.
um, so one thing I would say very quickly is, you don't necessarily have to contribute to MDM, but just try contributing to some documentation project somewhere which is open source.
Do you
And
know what documentation project is open source?
I
I'm gonna
think I
come
can
all the
guess
way
what
over
you're
to
going to
GitHub.
say.
What do you think I'm gonna say?
Free Code Camp.
Free Code Camp. So we've been learning on an open source project itself, and Free Code Camp is really friendly for contributors. So if you see something in the language that's a little weird, you could come here and either raise an issue and say, hey, this is weird, or you can give your own fix back. And I really like GitHub issues. They're like a complaints department. I'm going to come all the way back to just take a look because I've eaten up a lot of your time. I've eaten up a lot of our learners' time, and we've had a very, very conceptual chat about the topic instead of doing their project for them. This is further proof that Ramon is the nice teacher and I'm the mean one. But let's just talk about it. They already did the tribute page on their own. People have been turning it in. People have been showing us some of theirs, and it's so good. Ooh. If you had to build a tribute page to someone, who would you build a tribute page to?
Ooh, now that's a question, isn't it? Probably Cliff Burton, the original bass player of Metallica.
Oh, okay, that's very
There you
specific.
go.
So, folks' homework, if you're following along in real time, and a lot of folks aren't following along in real time, and that's super chill, is to please spend some time over the weekend or next week. This is not a right away thing. Sorry, I'm very, very professional day over here. Thank you, Miss Baby. Please spend some time and just do enough of this to get the tests to pass. So once this gives you all of your checks, I'm going to consider your homework for this project done. You can come back and fix it later and work on it a little bit later. Amazing. So, oh gosh, and the other homework is to have a very relaxing weekend if you can. I'm not seeing any questions, so I think I might go ahead and dismiss things early. Chris, do you have any questions for the learners or for the cat?
I was going to ask the cat how she managed to look that beautiful all the time.
It's the blur effect. So she's only beautiful because she's blurred out.
One small thing I was going to say about
Yeah.
documentation and contributing is if you are at all interested in contributing to documentation, but you're just worried that, what if I just fix a typo? Is that not enough? Surely I have to write a big scary page. Um, any decent documentation project will love you for your contributions from the smallest typo fix to the biggest set of stuff. In fact, it's always best to start with small things because they're the kind of things that people miss when they have these big goals of documenting this whole huge thing. There are lots of regular contributors to MDN which are really quiet and chill and in the background, and all they do is they just fix, say, 10 typos a week. But that gradually adds up to a huge amount of improvement on the site.
If I contribute to a documentation project like MDN, should I list it on my resume or CV or my portfolio page? Should I brag about it like it's professional experience?
Absolutely, because it is.
Amazing. So we'll talk about that a bit more. I'll go ahead and let you go. Thank you so much, Chris. And learners, thank you so much for, instead of doing your homework for you, we're doing your project for you, letting me just sort of break down a little bit about what we're going to start doing and talk about documentation and abandon you. We're going to be back on Monday, and Monday we'll be right back at doing the lessons and actually doing the code with you, I promise. And unfortunately, I'll still be around, but Ramon will be back as well. I'll let you go. Thank you so much. Bye,
This was super.
everybody.
This was super fun. Thank you.